as we get into this concept of seeing the present faster, what makes these analytics tricky, and this is where we get more into systems thinking. So that analytics stuff, you'll see lots of folks out there talking about analytics, but they're not really, all analytics are trying to understand a system. If you're in your car, it's the system of the traffic, and I'm trying to get somewhere and do something. That's the system with you're in. If you're in a university, you're trying to teach classes or hold classes or manage student careers. If you're in a business, you're trying to deliver services or keep employees motivated or manage your costs. If you're in a nonprofit, you're trying to deliver a service. All of these are systems. But the key is there's two parts of a system that we call the visible and latent system structures. And these are very important to understand because, like the name says, we tend to focus on the visible systems because it's easy to see. So this is a diagram that comes from my advisor's paper. And I put the link down here, or the name. But think of it this way. The visible system is what we can see. It's tangible. We can touch it. We experience it. And we tend to put policy paradigms, policy here could be a strategy for a business. It could be a policy like a corporate or university policy. It could even be a regulation, but we tend to move our policies through the visible system. The problem is there's often a latent system, and the latent system, like it sounds, is sort of an invisible, hidden, opaque, it's hard to see. This is a system that underlies the visible system, and we can talk about down here, this is everything from people's emotions, their psychographic behaviors, their thoughts and their sentiments. If this is just a simple model of me talking to people, the visible system is the people talking to each other, but the latent system is the day they're having, the current state of their emotions, the things they're dealing with from work or family that are affecting how that conversation goes. You won't see those, but it's definitely influencing the conversation. And in system structure, latent systems can also be things like policies that are in place, embedded policies. It can be systemic prejudices or biases. It could be errors that have been built up in the information systems. All of these things in the latent systems have a huge impact on the visible system, but we tend to ignore them, and we do it to our detriment. And often, this note here, you look at this feedback. We put a policy into the visible system. It then has to interact through the latent system before it can come back with an effect in the visible system. Again, these two are divided for convenience, but they exist one on top of the other. You can't simply affect the visible system without touching the latent. And the unintended consequences that often develop are coming from the latent system. And that's why all these things are so tricky in a complex system, is the things that we struggle with are coming from the very system that's hardest to see. All right, so what are some of these structures in the latent system? Well, I'm not going to go all over these today, but and I may touch on some of these else, but there tends to be different kinds. There's time delays. So that's just the simple time it takes the information to be collected, aggregated, distributed, and get back to you. That is often some of the biggest factors of the latent system, is that the information you think you're working with is old. And it may not seem old because it may seem that the report just came out that day, but there's a time delay. Latent capacity supports and latent capacity constraints, we may deal with these a little bit later. I'll touch on this on the limits to growth. These are things that within the latent system, a support is something that gives fuel to growth within the latent system, and a constraint is something that puts a ceiling. So you can think of these as floors and ceilings. And if you're trying to drive something down and there's a latent floor, you're going to have a hard time getting it lower as you want, because it's going to run into that floor. And you see this a lot of times with like drug policies or crime policies. We're trying to reduce drug use, but there's a latent support. Maybe it's from the culture, maybe it's from other factors, but it's a latent support that makes the policy of drug reduction very tricky, because there's poverty, education, all of these things could be latent supports to drug use. And if you don't address them, you're going to have a challenge. A latent constraint is a ceiling that acts on top of something, and if you want to get upward growth, it's going to act as a limit on that growth. Tragedy of the commons, you've heard this before. I'll go over it in detail in another episode, but this is when everyone shares a common resource, but no one really has responsibility to manage it. You tend to overuse that resource, you deplete the resources. Again, it's not visible, it's happening in the latent system. There's latent resource allocation and dynastic cycles. This is kind of a fun one, but in all organizations, you end up getting these dynastic cycles of leaders and followers, inheritors and proteges. Sometimes it's family related. Sometimes it's protege mentor relationship, sometimes it's, you know, succession plans, sometimes it's rank. And these dynastic cycles have their own latent structure. There's long wave cycles. So we think about patterns that are going through the environment. You know, I'll give an example. We think of the business cycle, it's 18 months, but there's other longer wave economic cycles that range from 5-year long economic cycles to even a Kondrativ wave cycle that I think is 75 years long. So these cycles, and these cycles exist in all sorts of behavior. These long wave cycles can often affect, I've talked about ones on business before that will, if you're in a downward cycle on the business, your strategy, no matter how good you are, has to deal with a recession, has to deal with an output. Conversely, if it's the internet boom times in the 90s, you may think that you're the world's best business person because your company's doing well, but it's benefiting from this gradual upward trend of a new technology, and you may make a merger like AOL Time Warner, and then it all crashes. The last one, the tipping points and threshold effects. This is what I want to go into with the latent capacity constraints. A tipping point and a threshold effect is a point in a latent structure where the system just flips like a switch. And what could have been good times become bad times, or vice versa. And it's a dramatic switch. It's not incremental, it's not marginal, and can have pretty severe consequences. And again, these structures, all of these kind of structures, they often live in the latent system. So unless you're using something like systems thinking to explore and make explicit that hidden system, you're going to be creating policy or strategy, and, you know, best of luck to you, but you're going to be running into these structures because you don't know they're there. It's like navigating a boat when you don't know the depth of the water or the chart of the currents. Appreciate your time today. If you have any questions on structured systems thinking, have a problem you'd like our help on, or want to know more about developing your own capabilities in systems thinking, please reach out at the email below. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in what we do and want to follow our journey, I've added our LinkedIn and Twitter information. And we plan to regularly update this channel with quick tips and case studies to help you get the most out of your systems thinking and lean efforts. If you want to be notified whenever we add new video content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the red subscribe button below this video.